How do you know if and when you're an alcoholic, or if you're drinking alcoholically? There's a lot of stigma around the word alcoholic, and I'm going to share with you some of my experiences along the way, which I hope some of you out there can relate to and pick up some of the useful pieces of when I first woke up to the fact that I had issues around alcohol. And I use that word again when I realized I was an alcoholic. Please subscribe and like the videos. And also, if you find any of the videos on this channel useful, please help me support the channel by perhaps buying me a coffee. And you can do that in the link below in the description, Ko-fi. And I'll be really grateful. It just helps support the channel along the way. Thank you. From when I was a small child, I always worried a lot. I always felt different. I can't really put my finger on it. I came from a very middle class background, if you like. My father was a bank manager, mum physiotherapist. But it was a really traumatic childhood. My father walked out when I was about 7 years old. I never saw him again after that. And my mother, God bless her, she crumbled under that weight and began to drink extremely heavily, vodka, and was also prescribed what they used to call in those days mother's little helpers, which were Librium tablets. And her coping mechanism was that, basically. And she became someone that we didn't recognize. And me and my brother sort of brought ourselves up, if you like, over quite a long period of time. We always felt different anyway. We didn't have, we didn't get sent much money, and we had to struggle along and sort of bring ourselves up. And consequently, we were different at school. We wore sort of second-hand clothes, and always felt different and lonely anyway, but was picked on and bullied. I used to use all of this stuff around my childhood as excuses later on in life around my drinking behaviours. But I've come to realise now that you obviously have to take responsibility if you're going to recover. But it certainly had that trauma and that pain certainly had an effect in shaping a lot of my behaviours later on in my life. I won't use it as an excuse for becoming an alcoholic, but I'm sure it all steered me in a certain path. But for as long as I could remember, I wanted to change the way I felt, because I felt uncomfortable in my own skin. I felt, even in a big crowded room of people, I felt the odd one out, lonely in that crowded room. And I had no confidence or self-esteem at all. I couldn't look at myself even in a mirror, even at a young age. I didn't like myself. So when I discovered at quite an early age that by taking nips from my mother's vodka that she hid around the house and taking some of those pills, I could change the way I felt, and suddenly had this massive surge of confidence, and suddenly became the clown amongst a group. This is how I fitted in. I became the maddest and the baddest, basically, and had to help me fit into a group. And that behaviour sort of continued throughout my life. Even when I was extremely successful in my career, I still used that crutch to give me confidence to fit into a crowd of people, to change the way I felt, to relieve the stress of life, I suppose, as well around that. I used to use it for all the wrong reasons. Gabor Mate always says that, that addiction and alcoholism, it's when you want to change the way you feel. You want to make yourself feel better. So you take something to do that, and by external means like alcohol or drugs or whatever, food, whatever it is. And then you crave more of it. But it always brings you negative consequences. But even after those negative consequences, you crave more and more again, and you just keep going round and round in that vicious circle. You can't stop when you start. And then obviously your body becomes dependent on that substance, and then it becomes a whole different ball game then. But even during my 20s and 30s, I was very lucky. I got into a job in nightclubs, nightclub security to start with, but found I had an aptitude for the club scene during the 80s and rose very quickly and was manager of a very, very good nightclub in the Midlands by the time I was 22 years old. But I look back then and certainly never thought of myself as an alcoholic then, but I look at my behaviours in those days and I was always the last to finish the party, if you like, the last to leave the party, always the drunkest, always the one that was passing out. I could never ever leave any alcohol or drug if there was any left. I'd keep going until it was, and always there was negative consequences around that. But I got, paradoxically, I got more and more successful. And the more successful I got and the more I got, the more I wanted. I had no, and still, even with all of that, had no self-esteem, no internal peace, serenity or happiness. I just craved more and more. I always felt restless, irritable and discontent, not just in my own skin, but with life in general. Nothing was ever enough. I wanted to gorge, if you like, on everything, and it was always moderation was a word that didn't ever figure in my languages. So I should have seen some of the signs, because a lot of the negative consequences involved me becoming a Jekyll and Hyde character. Around my drinking in particular was always carnage, violence sometimes, and which I'm not proud of at all. It changed my whole persona. It made me into an extremely aggressive, nasty version of myself that I wouldn't even recognize today. So it was problematic in those days, and it wasn't just binging. It was, I without realizing it, I was taking that first drink. Although you have power over that first drink, a true alcoholic is powerless after that because it can't stop. And that applies to drugs and addiction as well, obviously. So you have the power to say no to that first drink. But once you put that first drink or drug in your mouth, you're powerless. And then it dissolves into carnage, because you just can't stop. It ignites a craving and a compulsion and inside of you, obsession, and you just keep going and going and going. One would never be enough. And even when I had periods of, because I was lucky enough to meet a beautiful lady who's still my wife now. And we had two beautiful daughters together. Life was idyllic, and I got sober for a bit. I changed my life around drink in particular and drugs. I stopped all of that just for, but it was white knuckling. I didn't do it. I didn't ask for help or anything. I did it on my own ego, as I said in the last video. It was all on my own ego, and I thought, well, I can do this myself. So I took up running, and again, this addictive nature. What started off as jogging around the block turned into 7 marathons, 3 London, New York marathon, about 8 Great North runs. Consequently, I have a metal hip now. That's where the running took me over that, because it was another obsession. It was another compulsion to change the way I felt. And with negative consequences at the end, that was hurting my body, and I was using every spare minute I had, instead of resting or spending time with my family, running. It was in my 30s. But we were it was strange, because people would look at us on the outside and would see an extremely successful family, if you like. By this time, me and my wife were running pubs and restaurants and hotels together. The kids went to a lovely school. We were settled in a wonderful big business, taking about between sort of £3 million a year. And this is the 90s, and this was big money then, being paid really good salary. We had a lovely house which we owned. From the outside looking in, I had everything: material things, money, jewelry, the house, the beautiful family, everything going for me. And yet inside, I was empty. I had this massive hole in my soul. It was that wanted filling all the time with something. You know, if it wasn't exercise, it would be food. It would always be something. So, you know, I white knuckled it for a period of time, but eventually the drinking started again. And the problem with alcoholism when you stop drinking and you have a period of sobriety, as I said in the last video, when you fall off the wagon keeps rolling along when you fall off the wagon. So it gets worse, it's progressive. So when you start back again, you start at a much higher level and it escalates to a much higher level very quickly. And it wasn't long before I was dependent, if you like, on alcohol, drinking in the mornings. And I was in pubs and restaurants, so I was trying to disguise the fact. And very crazily, you know, I was doing so many stupid things, you know, driving with alcohol in my system, absolutely crazy things, you know, that I should never, ever have done. Consequently, everything was suffering around me, my relationships, my family, but I couldn't see any negative consequences. When you know you're an alcoholic, when you know you can't stop after that first drink, and all this carnage is happening around you, your relationships crumbling, your career starts to suffer, your finances start to suffer, your health starts to suffer, because by this time, when you become dependent, you know the health issues all start as well. You know, and all this takes you to a place where I discovered opiates shortly after this. This is a different conversation, a different video, and you can look back on the channel for that one. And things deteriorate much faster with opiates, the same way as alcohol, but a bit much quicker. It takes everything from you in much, much quicker. So I ended up in rehab and remained sober for a year or so after rehab, reluctantly. And I still wouldn't admit I was an alcoholic. I still didn't have the humility. I wasn't like all these people in the rehab. I was a white collar worker. I was, you know, a manager, and I had a big business, and I wasn't like all these alcoholics and addicts. That wasn't me. But I'll pay it lip service. I'll go in and do the rehab just to keep my family happy. You know, and this was the mentality, absolutely ridiculous. And I went in and came out and did some time after. Then I relapsed again. This time it was much, much worse, and it took everything from me. So this is when I knew there was a big difference then between the type of drinking initially, although you know it was a lot heavy drinking. At this stage, it was chronic drinking. You know, in the back of my mind, I was thinking to myself, you know, I'm having to drink every 2 or 3 hours here just to stave off withdrawal symptoms. You know, and that horrible fear around withdrawal. You know, alcohol withdrawal. The DTs and shakes, sweats and heart rate racing and horrible feeling of doom and terror that comes over you if you haven't got a drink anywhere near you. I had alcohol hidden everywhere, all over the place. So I was going, you know, and mints, crazily mints next to the alcohol. This is when you know that alcohol's really got a hold of you, when you're secretly hiding your drinking. And all these negative consequences around it, losing everything. And eventually that happened, and my relationship crumbled, and I had to move out. And I ended up here in Spain, and you know, this is 55, broken, and I more or less drank and drugged myself to death for the first year I was here almost. I was in a dark room, and you know, I wanted to kill myself. I was suicidal. By this time, I knew in my head that I was alcoholic, but I still wouldn't do anything about it. I still wouldn't ask for help. I was ashamed. I was frightened. I was in the midst of dependence and addiction, hopeless. You know, every spare moment was trying to find money for alcohol and drugs, trying to keep myself in a state where I wasn't in withdrawal, trying to get down to the shop. I used to walk down to the road to the shop, and that was agony, walking down to buy some alcohol, and I'd buy a cheap €1 litre thing of wine, drink it to stop myself shaking enough to walk back up the hill again. That's where it took me to. That's when you really do, you know you're an alcoholic. But even then, so I stopped, and this is when I started this channel, and that was nearly 6 years ago. And I had 5 years of sobriety. And I use this channel really to try and help other people and give service and learn myself, obviously. However, I still hadn't asked for help, and I still hadn't admitted truly that I was an alcoholic or an addict. In my heart, I knew. But it was always lurking there, and I was white knuckling. I was using exercise and all these sorts of things, other outlets to gain pleasure and to change the way I felt without realising it. I also hadn't dealt with any of the stuff, because it's not an alcohol or a drug problem. It's a problem in your head that you've got to fix. It's not it's not the alcohol and the drugs that are doing it to you. It's your head that you need to sort out. So any negative emotions, particularly anger and fear and self-seeking and ego and all of these things were my enemy. And I hadn't dealt with any of that stuff, and regret and all this stuff, worry. And it was catching up with me, and it was building up like a powder keg. And a year ago it exploded, and I became obsessed with, I could just have one. I was all right. I'd had 5 years of sobriety. I could just take one drink and I could control it now. It's the greatest lie any alcoholic can tell himself, because I had power over that one. I could have not took it, but I started obsessing about it and walking past the alcohol aisles in supermarkets. And then just one day I walked out with a bottle of vodka without even realising I'd bought it. And that was carnage, and I ended up in hospital nearly dead. And the thing is, it was only then that I woke up to the fact, Tim, you are an alcoholic. And I just dropped all the pretense and became willing and able to ask for help, which if you look at the last video, you'll see how I did that. And it's been the greatest year of my life this year, because everything's come back into it, or coming back into it. Relationships strong again. My grandchildren are in my life, and they've never seen me under the influence, thank God, and they never will. Finances are getting better. Purpose back in my life. I have a support network in place, a fellowship that will catch me if I fall. Things are going well, and I'm very blessed and very grateful for that. But if I'd woken up to the fact earlier on that I was after that first drink, I was powerless, and it was, I couldn't stop, and it always ended in carnage. And if I'd have dropped my ego and that pretense and admitted I was an alcoholic, but these are all what ifs, and regret is a useless emotion. I just go one day at a time now. Progress, not perfection, one day at a time, and live my life one day at a time, and build on my sobriety that way, and deal with emotions as they come up, and do my inventory at the end of the night in my head. And inevitably every day I could do better, but I always try harder the next day to be a better man and a better person, and to give service and to be helpful and to give back to fellow addicts and alcoholics wherever I can. That paying forward is very important for yourself, not just for your self-esteem, but just in general, to help a fellow addict and alcoholic. You can learn as much from them as they can from you, and that's really important. So I hope that's been some help. Obviously, I've gone over a long period of time there very quickly. If you want to listen to my life story in depth, it's further back on the channel. As I said, please support the channel if you can, and buy me a coffee on the link in the description, Ko-fi. I'd be very, very grateful. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like and share. Carpe diem. Seize the day today. Much love to you all. Thank you.